During a scene, Cherries mistook Tippi's head for a toy ball. She bit down on it so hard that the fang pierced through the skin, curled under Tippi's scalp, and Tippi vividly recalls the sound it made as the fang scraped against her skull. And this was all caught on camera, which they then used in the sizzle reel to attract investors.
I can't believe they did that. To have her head being bitten in the sizzle reel. And then for an investor to go, is she okay?
No, she died, Steve. She died.
No, maybe she's
Do you
there.
want to invest?
Yeah. Or she's there at the sizzle reel with like bandages around her head.
Poor Tippi. Welcome to the Compendium, an assembly of fascinating and intriguing things. A weekly variety podcast that gives you just enough information to stand your ground at any social gathering. We explore stories from the darker corners of true crime, the annals of your old unread history books, and the who's who of extraordinary people. I'm, of course, your ringmaster for this episode, Kyle Risi.
And I'm your dolphin swimmer person. Like on a show, then you have the dolphins that would like lift you up out of the water, or is it a whale?
No, it's probably a dolphin. I understand what you're trying to get at. What I'm having difficulty with is the struggling to come up with an interesting or an exciting character.
Is that not exciting? If I saw that in real life, that'd be exciting, and that's what I'm doing today.
You're hovering around the whole kind of like aquatic center right now.
I go through phases. I keep getting shipped around the different departments. I was in finance. I was in the toilets. Now I'm by the...
You're everywhere, man.
Yeah.
You're Mr. Dog's body.
Yeah.
Welcome, Adam.
Welcome, Kyle.
Before we kick off today's little saga, I think it's just time for a bit of housekeeping because we've changed things up a bit recently, haven't we?
You change things up.
Well, you don't appreciate the changes.
No, I'm kidding.
So if you've listened to our last few episodes, you might be wondering where All the Latest Things is. And the answer to that is that All the Latest Things is now its own separate episode. Over the last few months, All the Latest Things has slowly been encroaching more and more on the main topic of the week. Because it's gone from like traditionally 5 minutes to like 18 minutes. And that's just too much. And also, we have so much to say, so it needs to be its own episode. And so we've packaged these up as our own separate episode, which you can now listen to completely free of charge on Patreon at the Compendium Podcast.
That's right. We are on Patreon, where we release next week's episode, including all the latest things, a whole week early. This means there's no need to wait 7 days for your next fix.
And after you've listened to next week's early access episode, you can sign up to our Certified Freaks tier to unlock all of our yet-to-be-released episodes. And all the latest things can now be accessed as a standalone episode.
Also, if you do sign up, you'll have access to an RSS feed that you can add directly to Spotify. This will give you access to our regular episodes alongside all the latest things, all in the same feed.
Yeah, so if you're one of those people that want to see all the latest things and the feature episodes all in the same feed, you can then just add that into Spotify. And then bam, you've got it all together. So Adam, shall we get on with today's episode?
Let's do it.
Today's Compendium. We are diving into an assembly of ferocious ambition, feline chaos, and the price of a Hollywood dream gone wild.
Hang on a minute. I think I know what this is about.
Go on then.
Weirdly, last night you were like, oh, let's watch this real cult classic movie, and which never do you want to watch old films. Mm-hmm. And it was called Raw, about these lions. Mm-hmm. Are we covering this movie?
We are.
Oh, that's why you made me watch that awful movie.
You've been duped, Adam.
Actually, to be fair, it wasn't terrible. It was interesting. It made me feel quite anxious at some point.
That is the thing. So, as you know, I always go on and on about how I was born and raised in South Africa, running wild and free on the African plains. Well, today, I'm leaning into this in a big way by telling you a story that is quite literally out of Africa, even though it's filmed in the Hollywood Hills. Today is a fun one. It is a story that will have you rolling your eyes so far back in your head due to the sheer stupidity of what these people thought was a good idea. Our story today is going to follow a naive Hollywood couple who spent 11 years making a Hollywood film starring not only themselves, but also their kids and 150 lions, tigers, leopards, panthers, jaguars, and even a couple of deranged elephants in a film that they coined a ferocious comedy.
Hang on a minute. The main family, it was them that was making this movie.
Yeah, that's all them. They're all related. They are husband and wife and their 3 kids. 2 of the kids chose not to do it. I think they were adult sons anyway. But yeah, that's a whole family.
And they took 11 years. I had no idea about this.
Now, the film was meant to come with a message that highlighted the importance of conservation work and the urgent need to protect these wild cats, who by the 1960s were being poached for their pelts to the extent that conservationists were estimating that they would be completely extinct by the year 2000. So this glamorous Hollywood couple, inspired by a recent trip to Africa, felt that they needed to do something before it was too late. But what started out as wholesome intentions ended up creating one of the most dangerous films ever made, because throughout the entire filming process, production members were scratched, mauled, scalped, and even mutilated, in some cases coming very, very close to death.
Yeah, there were scenes where you can tell they used fake blood, but then there were other scenes where there's like, that was definitely not fake blood.
So today, Adam, I'm going to tell you about the 1981 box office disaster that was Roar.
So it didn't make money, or not enough money, clearly.
Oh, it was a complete failure. But it is now a classic. But it was a long road to get to this point. In fact, it was deemed so bad that it disappeared for almost 20 years before resurfacing in 2015.
That surprises me, because watching it, I don't know, I had this anxiety that you would only get when you watch a thriller or something like that, because you're like, shit, there's real lions and this doesn't look safe.
And it was hectic. It felt like we were watching for 5 hours. It was only a 90-minute bloody film. Everywhere the camera pointed, there was a fight breaking out.
Yeah, it felt like they were sometimes recording dialogue for a conversation. And then because there were lions fighting in the background, they had to then cut away to squeeze in a fight during a serious conversation. It was very bizarre.
So I reckon, because we're not doing all the latest things anymore, we just get straight into it.
Let's do it.
Adam, our story starts in the late 1960s in Mozambique, southern Africa, the country that inspired Nando's.
Okay.
Well, there's an important benchmark.
Yeah.
It is here in Mozambique that a fairly famous Hollywood actress called Tippi Hedren is filming a new movie called Satan's Harvest, which is going to be directed by George Montgomery. Now, Tippi Hedren at the time is probably most famous for starring in a couple of Alfred Hitchcock movies, including The Birds. And it would actually later emerge that she was totally tortured, man, by Alfred Hitchcock. There are some serious claims that he sexually assaulted her multiple times during filming of these movies, even forcing her to sign a contract that limited who she could work with in the industry. So it's just another Hollywood elite that you can add to the scumbag list, I guess.
To be honest, I've never heard about that with Hitchcock, because he's always put up this master filmmaker, but actually he's a bit more like Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, it sounds like Hollywood's just filled with Weinsteins, man.
Weinsteins.
So it's on this trip, she was being accompanied by her husband and manager, a guy called Noel Marshall. Now, he was a seasoned Hollywood producer in his own right. And midway through their trip, the couple heads off on a safari to some national park in the area, where they come across this incredible abandoned house near a river that's been taken over by a pride of lions. Now, the house was previously part of a safari lodge, and following the flood, nobody came back to claim the lodge, so it was adopted by this pride of lions. Tippi and Noel were really moved by this stunning sight of dozens of these lions that were just lounging around this abandoned house, like dangling out the windows, climbing up around the roof, just chilling out, man. So I can appreciate the aesthetic of what they're seeing there. All these wonderful lions just chilling out.
Is that the house that was in the movie?
No.
Or was it recreated?
It's not even close there. It was a really tiny little lodge. So
Okay.
You can't even compare the two from what we saw in the movie. What their guide explains to them is that the lions were actually there essentially hiding from poachers that were looking to capitalize on the high demand of pelts during the 1960s. And the lodge, being previously private land, therefore was out of the poachers' territory and had become this kind of unique sanctuary of safety for this pride, where they ultimately thrived. So being completely moved by this experience and the urgency of the plight of these magnificent cats, both Tippi and Noel recognized that there was probably some kind of Hollywood movie in what they were seeing in front of them.
Really? I'm not seeing it, but fine.
So they first started off with this concept of the lions living in a house. Then they imagined what it would be like if humans lived alongside these lions as part of this big interspecies pride, like man and lion living side by side in like complete harmony.
Okay, now I see it.
So their goal was to show that lions are these peaceful, loving creatures and not the monsters that the movies had previously portrayed them as. And they thought that this would help make people realize that owning like a lion pelt was no different to owning, let's say, a poodle pelt. They wanted to create this disgust in that notion of owning one of these pelts.
Okay.
So when Tippi and Noel get back to Hollywood, Noel sets out to start writing a script. Only problem was, he didn't have any experience in script writing. So he was going to have to learn. Eventually, he comes up with an outline, and it is fairly basic. And the premise of the story is that an American family are living in a riverside lodge somewhere in Africa with 30-something tame lions who are all essentially like their children or their siblings. The first big hurdle, though, that they come across is that they need to, first of all, source a bunch of tame lions. But they live in California.
Yeah, where do you find that? They just go to the zoo?
What they did is they did some brainstorming. They decided to approach a bunch of lion tamers to negotiate hiring their lions for the film. And they all pretty much said the same thing. A, you're absolutely nuts. And B, you can't put a bunch of adult lions in a small place like a house because they will literally fight each other to the death, including you.
Yeah, there are several problems here because it doesn't matter how tame a lion is. It's surely a wild animal,
Exactly.
which is unpredictable. And one is probably, you're pushing it, 30.
Oh, and there was way more than that, but we'll get onto that. So, of course, the resounding answer from the trainers was hell no. That was until one trainer suggested that the only way this might work, and I wrote that all in caps, is if they raise the lions themselves from birth. This way, they would essentially establish this familial hierarchy. Essentially, there would just be one big, pride.
And is that why it took so long then? Because they were rearing these lions?
Yes. So it took them 11 years to physically complete the project. And it's because they had to raise these lions from birth. Noel and Tippi are like, yep, okay. This film is very important to protecting the animals. And if this is the only option we have, then this is what we're going to do. And so off they go. And of course, that means that filming can't start until they have sourced a bunch of cubs and have raised them all to adulthood. And so, Adam, this is the start of that 11-year journey to raise a bunch of cubs to make this movie. And this, again, is just so wild to me because, as you just said, even raising lions from cubs does not guarantee that they won't try to eat you or rip your face off and then eat you.
And so what year is it that they start to raise these cubs?
So this is now 1970.
1970. And they think lions are going to be extinct by the 2000s. So they know that the movie won't come out for another 10 years. So within that 20-year gap, they've got to make sure lions don't go extinct. It's kind of like you're cutting out a third of the time that's left in order to save these creatures.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they thought a lot of these things through.
Okay, fine. Just putting it out there.
So in the 1970s, the pair of them sourced several baby lion cubs from various rescue centers from all across the United States. And sourcing them wasn't difficult because between the 1960s and the 70s, it was a huge trend for people to buy big cat cubs and own them as pets. But of course, it wasn't long before people began to realize that even as cubs, baby lions and tigers are extremely destructive, not just on your furniture, but also on their owners. Like, just think about how brutal a little kitten can be when it's scratching you. Now, just amplify that by 10, because they don't know that they're hurting you, right? So what would be like little pin scratches from a domestic cat would be deep lacerations from a lion cub. So before long, the market is just awash with people looking to get rid of their cubs, and this is where Tippi and Noel were ready to just start scooping them up. So they start raising all these rescue cubs, how you might raise essentially a kitten, in their Beverly Hills home where they lived with their 5 kids. Noel previously had 4 boys from a previous marriage, and Tippi had 1 daughter who, believe it or not, is Melanie Griffith.
And you did say, who is she the mother of?
So her daughter is Dakota Johnson from 50 Shades of Grey.
Ah, okay.
So you might remember Melanie from the 1988 film Working Girl. which obviously scored a couple Oscar nominations and a Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Musical or Comedy. So she's a pretty serious like Hollywood A-lister.
And so she's probably the most famous from this movie, right?
I would say so. I mean, Tippi Hedren was also quite famous. She starred in Alfred Hitchcock movies.
Yeah, of course.
Noel Marshall also has got a bit of a background, but I would say Melanie Griffith is probably the most famous one out of the lot.
Yeah, okay.
And at the time, though, Melanie, she's just 13 years old. Essentially, she's found herself living with a bunch of lion cubs, which grew into teenagers and then adult lions surprisingly quickly. But at this stage, they only had a handful of cubs. And if they were going to be making this film, they were going to need a hell of a lot more. So in 1971, Life magazine does a feature on Tippi and Noel and their kids and how gorgeous it is that they are sharing their home with these big cats, including a now 200-kilogram male lion called Neil.
Where they got Neil from?
Well, he is one of the baby cubs, so they grow pretty quickly, yeah. And Adam, he's massive. He's literally twice the size of Tippi. So in the Life magazine article, there are all these really crazy images of them living side by side with these animals. Like, they're not in pens or cages, Adam. They live in the house like regular domestic cats. One of the images is just of Tippi just casually reading the newspaper while she's lying down on Neil while he snoozes in their living room.
So they don't want to kill them then?
No, because again, remember the trainer was like, if you raise them from cubs, they will think that you are just
part of their herd.
Exactly. There is also another image of them all just swimming out in their back pool, and Neil is just like playfully grabbing at Melanie's kind of ankle while she jumps into the water. It's cute, but you just know that Neil is just testing to see if Melanie minds him like having a little nibble,
a little gnaw
on her leg. And then there's obviously probably one of the most famous photographs of Tippi and Noel all bundled in a bed with literally 5 teenage tigers all in the bed with them.
It's cool, I imagine, growing up with these tigers. And I imagine there are some really lovely moments. But I don't know, think of the litter tray.
Yeah, with like, and if they're eating meat and stuff, it's going to stink.
Do they have to get in fresh zebra?
Well, I mean, I don't know too much about what they're getting, but they do really pride themselves on the meat that they do feed them. Mm-hmm. So they're not skimping. They're not doing like a Joe Exotic where they're going to supermarkets and like taking all the out-of-date meat. They really prided themselves on the quality of the food that they fed them. But the thing is, though, while this all looks idyllic, it wasn't quite so cutesy cute for the neighbours who would often come face to face with a fully grown lion that had escaped and gone exploring around the neighbourhood. And of course, whenever this would happen, the neighbours would then just call the cops, who would then alert the appropriate authorities like animal control or animal protection. And so it wasn't long before Tippi and Noel were forced to move their entire pride of cats to a more suitable location, which is probably wise at this point, especially if they need to collect 130 cats, right? So they found an affordable piece of land in rural LA, and they decide to build a ranch there for their growing pride. Now, I say affordable. That's a bit of foreshadowing there, because the land was in an area that was prone to wildfires and flash floods. So not exactly the place that you want to set up a ranch filled with wildcats, especially if you need to move them really quickly in an emergency. But still, this is the spot that they chose where they're going to start filming their movie when they're ready. But of course, transforming the lodge to look like Africa, coupled with the burden of having to care for all of these lions, which by now they collected 50-something, meant that they were literally hemorrhaging money. So Noel decides that he's going to try and find some financial backers to help, but most people just didn't want anything to do with the project on account that they thought they were just utterly insane. It was only going to be a matter of time before someone got seriously hurt or mauled or even worse, killed, especially since they weren't strictly keeping the animals contained. So no one really wanted kind of their name associated with that risk, which I completely understand. You wouldn't want to be associated with a film that is essentially putting people's lives at risk.
Yeah, and also it's quite a long payoff because you're just, at the moment, seem to be putting your money to raising lions.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really think of that. Yeah, because it's more of a long-term investment, right?
Yeah.
Like, we have to raise these lions first, and then we make a movie, and then maybe you might get your return. But people probably want a return within a few years, right?
Yeah, I mean, sure, people do go into long investments, but you've got like, well, do all these lions survive? What happens if you decide, actually, I don't want to do it anymore?
No, because they can't find any backing, Tippi and Noel, they're forced to sell pretty much everything that they owned. I'm talking like properties, jewelry, clothing. And at this stage, remember, they were already a few years into the project. So the prospect of giving up now, after having spent all the money that they already had, just seemed to them like a complete waste. It was definitely like that concept of the sunk cost fallacy that was at play. Like they'd already come this far. They can't give up now. And so just to point out how much this was costing them, like remember, these are growing lions and they need a lot of meat to survive. At this point, they were feeding them fresh meat daily and it was costing $4,000 per week. Bear in mind, that's 1970s money. So that's the equivalent of $30,000 a week to feed all these animals.
Jeez. She must be doing other acting gigs and things like this to just keep things running.
I think that they had enough money to bankroll this initially. That yes, they had to sell some properties, but I think they just made it work.
That is a crazy amount just on food.
Just on meat. But the thing is, though, Adam, they were genuinely convinced that this movie would be a hit, and they were basing this all on a recent Oscar-winning movie called Born Free, which had been released shortly before all of this had started. And it followed this British couple that were living in Kenya who had ended up adopting an orphan lion cub called Elsa. And, of course, they didn't want to send the lion to a zoo, and releasing Elsa into the wild, especially unprepared, would mean that she could potentially get killed. So they decide that they're going to raise Elsa as a wild animal. And they teach her how to hunt, how to fend for herself. And eventually they set her free and it's really emotional. And then as you'd expect, there's this eventual reunion where they see that Elsa's become a mother of 3 cubs herself. And it's all really beautiful. Like I watched that loads growing up. It was like one of those seasonal films they just replayed year after year.
But you know the key thing with that, though?
What's that?
One line.
Yeah, exactly. That is it. But this was the dream that Tippi and Noel were determined to bring to life. So they just kept going. They kept adopting more cats whenever the opportunity arose, but it didn't stop at lions. Soon they were taking in tigers, cougars, leopards, jaguars, cheetahs, panthers, all of them. They weren't discriminating against the big cats anymore. The film was supposed to be set in Africa. And the last anyone checked, tigers, cougars, jaguars, they weren't exactly native to the continent. Now were they?
Oh, yeah. Did they even bring that up in the movie? Like, you've got tigers now or something?
They did bring it up in the movie, but this did mean that they had to rewrite the script to now start making it work, right? To top it off, the original concept of the lions that was central to the film's title, it was originally called Lions, Lions, and More Lions.
That was a terrible name.
That was. So they had to obviously change it to Raw to be inclusive of all cats. But they didn't just stop a big cat, so they also ended up like adopting an entire flock of exotic birds. They even had an ostrich at one point. They had an entire flock of sheep. And also, let's not forget, they had 2 fully grown elephants, which were called Timbo and Tembo.
Were the sheep to feed to the lions?
No, I think they were probably someone wanted to just get rid of a herd of sheep, but they weren't in the film. But all the other animals
because they were fed to the lions.
Possibly. And here's the thing, a lot of these animals, including the elephants, they came from previous owners who didn't treat them well. Many had endured like significant trauma, which only added another layer of unpredictability to their nature. Sure, you can try your best to raise wild animals correctly, but past trauma has a way of resurfacing, often in unexpected and dangerous ways. And let's not forget, they're still wild animals, Adam. So the instinct can kick in at any minute, no matter how you raise it. They could turn around and like rip your face off.
And they almost did a lot of the times when I was watching that movie.
Pretty much. Eventually, in 1976, they were finally ready to start filming. And by this point, they had a total of 130 cats. The first item on the agenda was to recruit a crew and some actors. And so to drive interest, they sent around a script which had now evolved to factor in all the non-native kind of African cats. And Adam, it's fucking wild. I don't know if you managed to pick up on what the plot was from the movie, but basically, this is the plot, right? Let's see how closely it aligns with what your understanding of the movie was. So the story is, of course, set in Africa. It follows a zoologist and a big cat enthusiast named Hank. Mm-hmm. Now, he is living in a large house on the shores of a big lake, tending to his conservation efforts in the area. Now, he is sharing the house with 150 lions, tigers, leopards, cheetahs, and jaguars. And this is all part of an experiment that he believes will prove to the world that humans and cats can form some weird multi-species tribe or pride together and live in harmony. And so after 3 years, Hank thinks that he's proven his little experiment to be a success, and he finally invites his family to come and stay with him at the lodge. Now, Hank's wife and their 3 kids, they have no idea that he has been living with these wild animals all of this time. Hank's intention was, of course, to fill them in when they finally arrived. But in the lead up to them arriving, they mix up their AMs and their PMs, oopsie, which means his family arrived 12 hours earlier than Hank had obviously expected. And so Hank isn't there to pick him up at the airport. He's actually away at some kind of conservation meeting a few towns away. When they arrive, they burst into the house with all their luggage. There's no sign of Hank. There's just lions, and more lions everywhere. And of course, they're all very excited to see them. Now, rather than just leave, they then spend the next 24 hours desperately trying to escape the cats who they think are trying to hunt them and eat them, not realizing that they just want to play. And Adam, it's just 1 hour of nothing but slapstick where Mum and the kids are hiding in cupboards, which the lions just appear to tear apart with their claws. They get chased, they get tackled, and all while the cats just completely demolish this house.
Yeah, so I did get the plot. Although saying that, I didn't really remember that that's what his goal was, that they're living in harmony.
So Hank obviously has to now try and rush back to get home to see his family. He gets caught up in all sorts of shenanigans along the way, including a very tenuous car ride, which results in more encounters with increasingly more aggressive animals. And so it ends up taking him 24 hours to get back.
Yeah, because there's kind of these somewhat comical scenes where they're running around the house and they're hiding into cupboards. One of them even gets into a fridge. Doesn't he empty the eggs out of the fridge?
Yeah, it takes him ages.
Yeah, and then he gets in there. Then 10 lions pound into the room. And then one of them keeps opening the door and he keeps shutting it. It's just all a bit stupid. But it did look like they could eat them, to be honest.
Yeah, it was petrifying. Of course, while this is all happening, eventually they just exhaust themselves after a day of fighting for their lives. So bizarrely, they end up just passing out, they fall asleep, and when they wake up in the morning, they're just surrounded by all these cats that are all just peacefully sleeping around them. Like no one's gotten eaten in the middle of the night, even though the whole day was just being chased, being attacked, being tackled, being pinned against the wall.
Yeah, it's almost like it's 10 o'clock, guys. Can we just call it a truce for the night? Let's all just settle down. We'll pick this up in the morning.
Exactly, it's so dumb. And then just as they're waking up, obviously Hank arrives and there's this big joyful reunion, and they realize that the cats were just being playful this entire time. And now they're just one big happy multi-species pride, and Hank was right the whole time.
And the way they made you realize this is when they're being chased, it was like dramatic music. Mm-hmm. But then when they were told, look, they're being friendly, then it's all comedy, nice music.
And basically, that's just the whole movie. All I can say is it's really messy.
Yeah, wasn't there a scene where 2 of the lions are fighting and he's trying to break them up and they're having a savage, real fight. Mm-hmm. There's blood that's being produced from these lions because they're clawing each other's face. And he's trying to break them up, and to the point where they swipe him and then he's bleeding.
Yeah, despite the awful plot and the glaringly obvious dangers, the script does somehow manage to attract a cast and crew willing to work closely with these lions and these tigers. But of course, Noel has a very specific hiring policy because he outright rejects any applications from any unionized workers because he knew that unions would only just impose rules and regulations on what he was allowed to do on set.
What, health and safety?
Yeah, based on what you said just a minute ago with him jumping in the middle of 4 fighting lions, of course a union worker's going to say, yeah, maybe you shouldn't do that. But also, hiring non-union workers also gave him that freedom to set his own pay rates because he'd already burnt through all his budget anyway, so he couldn't afford to pay anyone anything of substance, essentially.
So these are probably actors trying to get their first roles, right?
Mm-hmm. 100%.
Or who didn't read the contract, probably don't have an agent, because it probably says that if you die on this movie, you can't sue us.
Exactly. And definitely one thing that they definitely were lacking was an HR department. For sure. Not even close.
Did they have people as part of the crew that were there with tranquilizer guns or anything like that? Or?
No, they had a safety officer, but they had to take turns being the safety officer because they kept getting injured.
Oh my God.
The last major position that Noel and Tippi needed to fill was director. But of course, since no one was interested, big shocker, Noel decides that he is going to take the role for himself. classic case of wrote the theme tune, sung the theme tune, and so on. Only problem was he has zero experience directing, which I think is pretty clear. I don't know. Is it a case that he was a bad director, or is it a case that he was working with 150 lions?
I think it's probably a little bit of both, because there's shots where like he is speaking to another person, I remember who it was now, another character, having a serious conversation, and it cuts away to a lion, and in the next shot, a panther's on his face. And it's like, but that panther wasn't there.
And he's got no clothes on because they've all been ripped off, and it's like, continuity.
And then another shot and the panther's gone. It's just like, hang on a minute. Could you not reshot this? But it makes me feel like they just couldn't reshoot things because they're like, that's probably the best shot we'll ever get on this.
It's practically a golden rule of filmmaking. Never work with kids and never work with animals. And lions and tigers, they just don't care about staying on their mark or staying in frame just because you ask them nicely. Do they?
Even if you raised them, they're still not going to do that.
Also, finding actors willing to take on the human roles wasn't much easier. Like Tippi, naturally, she was cast as Hank's wife. So in the film, that is Tippi Hedren. But as for the lead role of Hank, she really wanted Jack Nicholson, but surprisingly, he obviously refused. Obviously looks at the script, did have someone of substance to read through the contract and was like, yeah, don't do this. You will die. And so once again, Noel steps in and casts himself as Hank. So he is, at this point, the producer, the writer, the director. He starred in the film. And let's be honest, when all this goes belly up at him, there's not going to be much room to blame anyone else other than himself.
To be honest, he's probably the only person that can star in it and run this show, because it's his idea in a way, and he's crazy enough to do it. And also, he's raised these lions. And so if there's anyone that's going to break up a fight between four lions, it's going to be him, sort of thing.
I think that's smart, because the same situation with the kids, right? They couldn't find anyone willing to pay the kids. So Noel just cast his two sons, John and Jerry, as the boys, and of course 17-year-old Melanie Griffith as the daughter. According to Noel and Tippi, this made perfect sense because the kids already had that bond with their cats, right? So bringing stranger actors in might have been harder for the animals to kind of accept them as part of their pride. So it made sense, but also I don't get the sense that Melanie Griffith wanted to do this.
She's like, okay, Dad.
What absolutely blows my mind is that 5 years in, that nothing fatal had happened up to this point. I don't comprehend that in any way. Like, at first their strategy was to raise cats from cubs so that they would be tame and more socialized. But over the years, they just began rescuing whatever big cats they could get their hands on. And many of these animals came with problems. In the end, they did get their 130 cats plus other animals. There is no way that they were able to form a close bond with every single one of them. So therefore, it's genuinely a miracle that nobody was mauled or eaten.
Jeez, yeah, I didn't even think of that.
Unless someone was mauled and they just covered it up. I guess it would be easy to, right?
Yeah, if there's no union about, then you just quickly bury Jerry. No one's going to ask around him.
Is there even a need to bury Jerry?
Oh, yeah, good point. It's like, kids,
we can save some money on food. Yeah. I can't even imagine what her childhood must have been like growing up, Melanie Griffith. Like, Dakota Johnson is on the record of saying people don't fully appreciate how nutso my mother's childhood was. And the thing is, though, we don't really get too much information from Melanie Griffith. And it makes me question whether or not it was just a really traumatic time for her, and that's why she doesn't talk about it.
I mean, I can understand that because you're forced to live with these lions, and all your friends have probably got normal sort of upbringing, and it's because her parents are heavily invested in this project that they can't say no to now anymore. And
I can also imagine that if Noel has got everything riding on this, he's probably really obsessive and probably really insufferable as well, which he is.
And I wonder if he likes the lions more than he likes his kids.
Do you reckon?
I don't know.
So Adam, I think this is a great time to take a quick break, and when we get back, filming is about to kick off.
Okay.
Hey freaks, if you've been enjoying the show, we've got a small favour to ask.
Yeah, we need your help, and it's super simple, but it makes a massive difference. Last time we asked you guys to leave reviews, the response was overwhelming.
You all really showed up for us, and we loved reading every single one of your reviews. But we've got to keep that momentum going. So, if you're a seasoned Compendium podcast listener, or even if you're new here and you love what you're hearing, could you please take a quick second to leave us a review?
It's super easy. If you're on Spotify, all you got to do is click that star button and give us a 5-star review. Nice and quick, done in like 2 seconds.
But if you're feeling extra generous and you've got a bit more time in your hands, then head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a sweet, thoughtful written review. Trust us, this will go a long way.
Or if you're like, I don't use podcast apps, no worries. You can still show us some love by going to our website, thecompendiumpodcast.com, and leave us a review there. We've made it super easy.
The more reviews we get, the more listeners we can reach, and the better episodes we can bring you. It's a win-win, really.
So yeah, hit that star, leave us a review, and help us grow this amazing community. We appreciate it more than you know.
So, should we get back to the show?
Let's do it.
So, Adam, we're back. Where's your mind at? What are you thinking?
I'm thinking these people are crazy.
I think that's a fair assessment. I can't imagine the pressure that Hank must be under, knowing that he has to make this film, and the pressure that he's been living with for 11 years, knowing that he has to make this a success.
Yeah, and just a crazy thought. They're shooting at this house, and because they're pretty territorial, if they're like a regular house cat, they'd be like spraying and like
Gross.
making things their sort of territory. That place must have stank.
Do you reckon? Probably. Unless they got all the boys neutered. I don't know. I doubt it, though. Those boys look pretty horrifically ferocious.
Yeah, and probably when they pee, it's probably like a bucket.
Oh, gross. Ew. Filming finally kicks off in 1976. Now, they originally thought that it would take 6 months. Instead, it drags on for 5 more years.
5 years of filming?
Yep. Delays came from every direction. But the biggest issue was, of course, animals are a fucking nightmare to direct, right? And like we said earlier on, lions don't care about hitting their mark or staying in frame just because you ask them nicely. So getting them to do anything on cue really required an absurd amount of motivation. Their go-to tactics were to lure the animals with live chickens, or even worse, chase them around with fire extinguishers. Isn't that horrible? But here's the thing, if the lion didn't feel like cooperating, there was pretty much nothing that you could do about it. Most days, they were lucky if they ended up with a few minutes of usable footage. And on a really good day, they'd end up with just a few minutes of footage, but no one was sent to hospital. And that's the main reason why the whole production took so bloody long, because the lions just don't want to do it. And Adam, we know clearly from the descriptions that we've gone through already that there were injuries. But I can tell you now, there were a lot of them, and they were horrific. There's no easing into this because injuries were literally dished out from day one. There were bites, scratches, broken bones, like severe infections. Because, of course, lions' mouths are like harbors of bacteria, right? And out of the 140 cast and crew who worked on this film, 120 of them had to go to hospital at least once. It's about to kick off. Tippi herself, obviously, she ended up in hospital several times. The worst injury she got was courtesy of a lion named Cherries. Now, during a scene, Cherries mistook Tippi's head for a toy ball. It bit down on it so hard that the fang pierced through the skin, curled under Tippi's scalp, and Tippi vividly recalls the sound it made as the fang scraped against her skull. And this was all caught on camera, which they then used in the sizzle reel to attract investors.
I can't believe they did that. To have her head being bitten in the sizzle reel. And then for an investor to go, is she okay?
No, she died, Steve. She died.
No, maybe she's there.
Do you want to invest?
Yeah. Or she's there at the sizzle reel with like bandages around her head.
Poor Tippi. Tippi, of course, she's rushed to hospital, right? Where she needed a bunch of stitches. But in order to properly stitch her up, they needed to shave her head. But Tippi was like, no, I do not have time for my hair to regrow back. So she insisted they just stitch her up as is. And that's exactly what they did. So she has this awful scar under her hairline. And the injuries, Adam, they just kept coming. One of the worst injuries came from Timbo. That's one of the deranged elephants. They were trying to film a stunt where Timbo was supposed to gently lift Tippi up with his trunk and place her on his back. But when Noel called action, Timbo yanked Tippi off the ground in such a way that she snapped her ankle, and then Timbo finally plonked her on his back. He then bucks her off, which she then falls and then shatters her wrist. That was the scene that we watched twice last night. Do you remember when she was running away and her wrist is just flailing around and it's clearly broken?
It didn't look right, but she was a trooper and she carried on, which I'm surprised about. But I guess, again, they've got to get the footage. They've got to make it work.
Yeah.
I have to... she should have won an Oscar.
At one point, Adam, she develops such a major infection, like an inflammation of the vein, they call it, which essentially turned to gangrene. This got so serious that she had to be sent to intensive care for a few months alongside one of Noel's sons, who was there on a separate incident. And when she recovered, she was then back on set, almost as if nothing had happened. You're right, she's a trooper.
Yeah, and thank God that they're family, because there's no other way any other actor would be going back to that set.
It is wild to me that they just didn't shut the whole thing down right there and then at that point, because of course that is your wife, right? She has been injured. She's had her ankle broken and she's had her wrist shattered. But remember, I guess they believed that this film was going to have this major positive impact and get people behind protecting these animals. Plus, Adam, they didn't come this far to just give up. 5 years in now, right? They've got another 5 years to go. You're halfway through.
Yeah.
So just keep going. And so, as you can imagine, this leads to a total disregard for their safety, including their kids. And don't be fooled, the cats also injured the kids. At one point, Melanie did quit because before filming, they would establish like the safe word, which they would shout whenever they wanted to get out of a situation. But during a scene that was getting really out of hand, Melanie repeatedly shouted that safety word, but Noel just ignored her because he felt that the authentic fear in her face would look amazing on camera.
No.
No, it's so awful. And following this, she tried to quit, but Noel just convinced her to come back. And surprise, surprise, shortly after, she sustained such a major gash from the corner of her mouth right up to her forehead, narrowly missing her eyeball. It was so bad she needed 50 stitches and several rounds of cosmetic surgery to try and minimize the scar. So she was scarred for life because of this. And it's all because he was negligent.
So generally, I can understand why she doesn't want to talk about this now, because not only metaphorically scarred from life,
but physically as well.
Yeah.
And of course, the boys got injured as well. One time, a lion got hold of John's head. He locked onto it for 25 minutes while other crew struggled to get the lion to let go. He ended up getting 60 stitches. Of course, it scarred up like a bitch because an infection set in as well.
And is that why he went into intensive care?
No, so that's Jerry. So right. Jerry, he's the other son. He ended up losing a pint of blood on his way to hospital after a lion got him in the leg. And again, a major infection set in. So he was intensive care right there alongside Tippi, just within days.
I can't believe this. This is horrendous.
It's so bad. Of course, Adam. Tons of crew left as well, mostly after being attacked themselves. This meant that as well as starring in the movie, Noel's sons had to take on roles of the crew as well. So they handled things like the boom mic or filled in for injured cameramen, even filling in as the first aid officer because they kept getting attacked. I mean, that's your whole job and you kept getting attacked.
I mean, maybe he's the first aid officer is probably the most safety conscious and is getting himself into loads of trouble, which everyone else is just running away.
Adam, think about it though. Like, attacks are not coming from one direction. It's literally 360 degrees. They're above you, they're below you, then the sides of you, then the left of you, the right of you, everywhere.
It feels like you're in a trap, like you're fallen into some, I don't know, dark cave and there's just like monsters everywhere.
Yeah. And when you're in the house, because of course there's balconies, there's stairs, they are literally everywhere.
There's a scene which I don't know if it's intentional or not. You never know with this movie. But I'm pretty sure Hank is trying to convince someone that they're really friendly, they're lovely. And then all of a sudden, this lion comes running off camera and just tackles
Tackles him.
and pushes him over. And then about 10 lions just jump on top of him. Like any moment he could have been mauled. And he's like trying to smile to the camera, going like, this is great.
Yeah, he's like, oh, that's Togar. Don't mind him. He's the boss around here. And he's literally, his hand is bleeding, his face is bleeding, his clothes are literally ripped off. And like, he's saying all these words, but he's holding his hands out in front of him, like in fear.
Yeah.
And he's like, hey.
There is that other actor. I don't know what his role exactly was. He was the one that was the friend that he was getting the tour of the place at the very beginning.
TiVo.
Yeah. You can tell he was scared.
He was scared.
Because he was on edge all the time.
At one point, 20 crew members quit on the spot after seeing the director of photography, Jan de Bon, getting literally mutilated. It was Cherries again. That's the one who'd already bitten Tippi, right? Mm-hmm. What had happened is that while Jan was shooting a scene from under a tarp, as the lions were supposed to run past, his movements caught the attention of Cherries. She then went over to investigate. She swipes, peels his scalp all the way from the back of his head right to his forehead.
No.
She scalped him.
I don't know what to say. I'm just shocked. I mean, I was generally in fear for their lives watching some of it, but hearing these stories.
So he had this bloody flap of hair and skin just dangling over his face.
No.
And for a moment, he didn't even realize what had happened. So John then rushes over. He flips the flap back over in place. He wraps his head in a towel and he drives into hospital. And then soon as Jan was out of sight, John is on the phone calling around for a new director of photography because his main concern was making sure that they didn't lose too many more days of shooting.
This thing should have been shut down. Why were the police not alerted? I don't know. This is horrendous. Even why did the crew not complain to someone if they all like quit on the spot?
Guess because they're not unionized, who are you going to complain to, hey? Who is it?
Yeah.
But luckily, Jan didn't want to leave because as soon as he was stitched up, by the way, he required 220 stitches. That's a lot.
That is a lot.
He went straight back to set, but they did lose 20 crew members that day.
I'm sorry, these people are crazy if they keep going back.
Yes, but here is the coolest thing. Because Jan went on to direct some huge blockbusters, including Speed 1, Speed 2, Twister. He was the cinematographer for Die Hard. So he became this really big deal in Hollywood, and Raw was where he started.
Wow, so he'd learned that kind of a nail-biting kind of action movies.
Yeah, I mean, some scenes in the film were good. And that was probably because he filmed those bits.
Yeah, to be fair, there were moments which were entertaining.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing was entertaining.
For the wrong
reasons. Then, of course, there's Noel. He gets attacked a lot. Mostly it's because he's determined to get a decent shot of the action. In the movie, he's constantly just dripping with blood. He's constantly being pinned, constantly being tackled. He gets swiped left and right all over the place. And remember, this film was meant to feel wholesome in parts. But despite the absolute chaos that you're watching on screen, the dialogue, as we said, is like, oh, Togar, come on. It's no time for playing. Meanwhile, in the background, there's literally a fight to the death happening between 3 male lions.
Did any of the lions die?
Well, we'll get on to that.
Oh, no.
Yeah. It is sad. But Noel, when he's talking to the lions, he uses that kind of polite tone of voice. Kind of like that tone of voice that you use when someone else's monster kid is being an absolute bastard to you right in front of their parents. And you're like, oh, no, Gary. No, Gary, don't do that. No, Gary. When you really want to say, tell your fucking kid to get off of me. You know what I mean?
You want to hit Gary.
Yeah. That's how he was talking. He was being so polite and like nurturing and loving towards these animals because, again, it was a family film.
Yeah.
When really he was like, don't bite my fucking hand. Please let go.
And also, I guess the whole point of this movie is that these humans and animals can live in harmony together, which they absolutely cannot.
Look how they destroyed the house. They didn't even have a house at the end. In harmony. Oh, better get the builders in again. One of the dumbest things he does, though, as we mentioned earlier on, is he jumps in between 4 fighting lions trying to break them up. And he's kind of like yelling at them and he's slapping them. And then boom, one of the lions chomps down on his hand and there's just blood everywhere. And the cameras just keep rolling. And then the next thing, he's in the house surrounded by 40 other lions trying to bandage up his hand. By the way, this makes it into the final cut. And while he's trying to stop the bleeding, there's these 8 other lions just like tugging at the bandage that's dangling down. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. He can't get anything done. And that's what I mean. Every second of the film is just one hectic moment after the next. Yeah, it's brilliant.
It's like dangling some string along to a kitten, and they just won't let go. And he's trying to like carry on with the scene.
He's but I'm bleeding, Togar. Gary, don't do that. And of course, he gets loads of infections, which nearly kills him when it develops into sepsis and gangrene. And there were 3 separate injuries to both his legs and his arms, where literally doctors seriously floated the idea that if the infection got any worse, they would have to amputate. So it's remarkable that nobody was killed in this film. Obviously, as more and more crew members left, they began sharing their stories of the numerous close calls they had experienced, and soon the media started reporting that this was yet another cursed production by Noel Marshall, because Noel's career originally took off after he worked as a producer on The Exorcist.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So now people were drawing these parallels between The Exorcist and Raw, saying, oh, The Exorcist curse strikes again, which, I mean, pretty much did. Another major story that makes the headlines in The Hollywood Reporter was when the assistant director arrived on his first and only day on set, and he was viciously attacked. Basically, Togar, one of the lead lions, bit the assistant director clean through the neck, missing his jugular by just 1 centimeter at him.
Oh my God.
He also then pulled his ear off. And obviously, while he survived, it was reported as being nearly fatal. And again, another casualty that had to undergo extensive surgery because a lion had attacked him. Literally ripped his ear off.
Like, what kind of insurance do you have for this?
No one was going to cover that, are they? But basically, Adam, hopefully that explains to you why all of this took 5 years to finish the filming.
Yeah, and what's weird is the fact that the cast don't look like they've aged much. I don't know. I really want to rewatch it now, knowing that it's 5 years, because I just...
Yeah, I guess so, because Melanie would have been, 17 at the time, so they probably finished filming at, 23?
Yeah.
But basically, the delays are all due to the many, many casualties. But also because the ranch was built on a floodplain and prone to wildfires. So inevitably, these things were going to happen eventually. And after a 3-meter flood, the set was completely destroyed. So they had to rebuild the entire thing from scratch. That flood knocked down the fences that were keeping the cats in the complex. So 15 of those cats escaped and they started roaming around California. And the sad thing is that some of them were shot by the police.
Oh, no.
Including the star of the film, a huge lion that they called Robbie, which again delayed filming until they found a replacement, which they couldn't. So that's why some lions have that blood in their face, so they can go, oh, that's that lion that we're talking about, because we've seen him before with all the blood and he's the bad lion or whatever.
Okay.
But also wildfires tore through the ranch as well. Again, destroying the set. And again, they had to rebuild it. Luckily, though, no animals were lost during the fires. But again, it just caused more delays. And more delays were caused by just the ferocious fights that would break out between the lions, which we saw firsthand. Having that many male lions in such a small, confined space, of course they're going to fight. They're competing for territory. And so having to treat all of their injuries just ended up costing a ton in vet bills.
I was just thinking the money that must have been spent on this production. Do you know how much was?
I do, and I'm going to come on to that, but I want to tell you about one more delay.
Okay, fine.
So there was also an outbreak of a feline virus as well that resulted in a bunch of the lions needing to be put down as well because they were kept in such a confined space. They weren't in pens or anything, but the territory of the ranch just wasn't big enough to house them all. And so they were literally hemorrhaging money and blood. And blood all over the shop. So the initial budget was $3 million with a 1-year timeline. It ended up taking 11 years, and they spent a total of $17 million US. In today's money, that is $93 million.
That's not as much as I thought it could have got up to.
But you thought it was more?
But I do wonder if that's what's reported. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering about all these extra, like, vet bills and whatever bills, if that's included, because that could be just production cost.
Yeah.
Then you've got everything else.
But also along the way, they lost all of their investors. So yeah, $93 million now, all of a sudden, seems a hell of a lot when you don't have any investors, right?
Oh, yeah.
It did reach the point where they just had to stop altogether. So they decided that they were just going to make do with the footage that they had so far, hoping that they could piece together enough of a plot as best as they could, which is why the plot is so messy and almost in some places impossible to follow.
Yeah, it kind of ends abruptly a little bit, doesn't it? Like, oh, everything's all happy families after a while.
Adam, you didn't even see sunset come. Remember they fell asleep and then it was morning, but this all happened during the day.
I think I was still in shock. I didn't really question the plot holes.
There was no night scene.
Now that you say that, yeah. And you say like the feline virus and everything that, and a few others that got killed. But I'm sure at the end of the movie, didn't it say no animals were hurt?
Yeah. So that means no animals were hurt during the rolling of the cameras, during the making of the film. Of course, there were loads of casualties. Some got shot, some died from feline like virus or whatever. Some of them killed each other.
So they're trying to like protect the lions.
Mm-hmm.
But actually...
Oh, we're going to come on to the irony bits in a second. But finally, in 1981, they cobbled together the final product, and it was marketed as a family-friendly adventure comedy. And the tagline was a ferocious comedy. But surprise, no American distributor wanted to touch the movie at all. And that's because everyone had heard about what a nightmare filming was and the huge number of casualties. And the fear was that if they distributed the film and it gained any amount of success, then people would file lawsuits for the injuries that they had sustained. Mm-hmm. Not to mention, distributors didn't want to be associated with a film that had exploited non-union workers, endangered their lives, and probably mistreated a bunch of animals. Plus also, the movie was pretty bad.
They probably think, yeah, this is not going to make money.
Apart from a few scenes which were obviously shot by Jan de Bont, largely it was a bit of a catastrophe. Hang on. Let me take that back. I really liked watching it. I really enjoyed it, but I liked it for what it was, and that was a pile of crap.
Yeah. Yeah, and there were some amazing bits of footage of the cats and stuff like that, which you even throughout the whole craziness, there's a lot I can appreciate given how traumatic this shoot was. The fact that they managed to even put out a film with no one dying, I think is a miracle.
Yeah, exactly. You could even argue that this was the luckiest film ever made, not the most dangerous. But the thing is, though, the story was stupid, the dialogue was appalling, the acting was even worse, and the overdubbing, that was amateur at best. So I loved it. I mean, we've said it so many times. It was just scene after scene of people just being mauled by animals, screaming, crying, bleeding, all while trying to make out that what you're seeing on screen was just play between humans and beasts, essentially. Also, they set it to this really goofy music, so all you heard was like dum da dum da dum ba bum ba dum ba dum ba.
Yeah.
And the thing is, my theory is that they had to do this so that the viewer would know that it was meant to be a family-friendly film, in spite of clearly seeing like someone getting slashed by a tiger. Otherwise, they wouldn't know that it was meant to be like joyful.
Yeah, exactly. There was moments where someone's being gripped by a lion, and you're like, oh, this is a fun part.
So the film ends up being screened only in a handful of countries, including the UK, Germany, Australia, and Japan. But the screening only lasts a week, and then it just disappears. So it took basically 11 years, $17 million, tons of injuries, and it didn't even make $2 million. So the next year, Tippi and Noel, surprise, they filed for divorce as a direct result of the movie and also how Noel treated his family.
And so it's interesting that she filed for divorce. So she wasn't happy the way that he treated the family,
no.
But she went with it because of they needed to get it done, maybe?
I guess so, yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
In the divorce, Tippi, she obviously got to keep the ranch, which she ended up transforming into a big cat sanctuary named Shambhala Preserve. And today, basically, she's doing what Carol Baskin does.
What, she killed her husband?
I think if they had stayed married, that might have happened. But today she's 94. She's still running the ranch and she continues to take in rescues. She also raises money and awareness against the exploitation of exotic animals. And since then, she's written 2 books and she completely, which I respect, completely acknowledges that what she and Noel did was utterly stupid, that they were just arrogant and they should never have created such a dangerous environment for themselves and for others. And she says that while she regrets what they did, she was very heavily led by Noel, which you can get a sense of in the film. But I genuinely think that they were acting with integrity because remember, in the 1960s, they were predicting that poaching would wipe out a ton of different species by the year 2000. So they felt that they needed to act with urgency. And they were from Hollywood. And so the only thing that they could offer in terms of skills was make a movie, right? You lean into what you can offer. And I guess just along the way, they just ended up losing their way.
I think they're just too far into it to really turn back. I mean, they could have created a very similar movie, maybe with just 5 lines or 10 max. And it would have probably still had the same effect. This guy living amongst a herd or a pack. What are they called?
A pride.
A pride of lions. And that would have been nice. And probably less people would have been injured.
Less people would have been scalped, mauled, or pinned and attacked.
Yeah, and no lions may not have been killed. And
exactly.
And they probably would have been shot in a year or 2. And do you know what? It probably would have made money.
I guess they just wanted to go big, right? Let's go big or go home.
Go home.
I respect what they did. I don't like some of the things that happened, but I respect what they did.
Yeah.
As for Noel, Raw pretty much ended his career in entertainment. He did try working on 1 or 2 projects after this, but that didn't work out. So he found a new career in hospital administration. And eventually he sadly died from a brain tumor in 2010. So he lived a long time, but for all those years, the movie just got lost to history until 2015, when John Marshall, one of Noel's sons, managed to convince a distribution company who specializes in like hidden gem type movies to buy the movie. And the original poster, which features 2 lions in an old style car with the tagline "ferocious comedy" on it, that ends up getting replaced with real images of Noel being mauled. And they give it a new tagline, which is appropriate: "The most dangerous movie ever made."
Yeah, that works better. That's what it's known for, right? And I guess this rebranding really helped it.
I think it did, because it did really well. It sold really well on DVD and Blu-ray under kind of the cult classic genre. And since then, it's now accessible entirely on YouTube. I don't know how much longer that's going to last for, but there really is no excuse. Everyone should go and watch it. Of course, we'll link to that in the show notes. But as for Melanie Griffith, she hasn't said very much about the experience at all. The only real snippets that we've gotten are on the rare occasions where Dakota Johnson has briefly mentioned how wild her mother's childhood was growing up. But as we alluded to, I just get the sense that Melanie just doesn't want to revisit it. And it's probably because it was a very traumatic time for her in her life. So I guess we understand that, right? Especially that memory of someone you love deliberately putting you in a dangerous situation, agreeing to use your safe word, and then just ignoring you. That just must be traumatizing.
Yeah,
you would never do that. Our safe word is banana.
Banana.
So John Marshall does attest to how horrible Noel was growing up, especially on set. He talks about how short his temper was and how he just became completely consumed with making Raw. And I guess it just became an obsession for him. After all, he sunk everything that the family had into that. So it literally was ride or die, but at what cost? Because in the end, he was left with nothing except, obviously, strained relationships with his family members.
He wasn't left with the lions, was he? He could keep them.
Do you know what? I do not know what happened to the lions. I guess a bunch of them must have gone to the Shambhala Preserve with Tippi, but 130 of them? Damn.
I can just imagine everyone deserting on the last day, leaving him with all these lions. And it's got
see ya.
Yeah. And what am I going to do with these?
So if you watch it, be prepared for 90 minutes of utter chaos, but also be very aware that the violence and the blood and the injuries and the fear that you see is all real. And I felt really bad for the animals because this isn't their natural environment. No matter what the set looks like, because it looked like Africa, that's California. Mm-hmm. And there's just no way that many lions are getting proper care and attention that they need. The irony is that while a film was meant to bring awareness and end poaching, somewhere in that process, they inevitably probably caused trauma to the very same animals that they were trying to protect.
Yeah, and they probably didn't even think of that when they were doing it at the time.
No.
It's only in hindsight, or probably if you just take stock of what's going on, what have we done?
So if you do make it through the entire film, and I mean, if you make it to the very end of the credits, they do include a sort of to-do list that the viewer can kind of adopt to help end animal exploitation. So they made all of that, where the actual purpose of that film was those 4 little bullet points at the very, very end of the credits, where it was like, oh, you can like not buy furs, or you can support like a non-profit organization that supports animals, or like you should show disgust at anyone who like buys ivory or buys a fur coat. There's 4 things like that, but that was it at the very end of the film.
Yeah, and they're really making a wild assumption that people are going to sit through the entire movie and then the credits.
We did.
We did. That's true.
But I knew to look out for the credits.
Oh, okay.
The good news is that after this fiasco, new rules were actually introduced to govern how animals are treated on movie sets. But you also have to appreciate the irony of making a movie about saving and protecting animals that ended up being so bad that it resulted in new laws.
About protecting animals.
Win-win, I guess. And Adam, that, my friend, is the story of Raw, the most dangerous film ever made.
That is a wild ride.
I'm really glad that we watched last night. I'm glad you watched with me.
Yeah, it was fun. Definitely worth a watch. It's just, you have to see it to believe it.
If you do want to know more, like I said, watch the film. You can access on YouTube free of charge. There are also, of course, a couple 20 to 30 minute kind of making of videos. If you can find them, I can find them out there, but they do exist. They're listed on the website.
I would have loved to have watched the behind the scenes movie.
Yes.
Of people just being shipped off in like ambulances.
Oh, God. Actually, I'm going to try harder to find them because they're listed on their website, but I couldn't find any digital copies anywhere. There are obviously a few videos floating around with interviews with some of the actors. One of the most famous interviews is of one of the native Africans who starred in the movie. That's Mativo, the guy that you saw at the very beginning. And almost everyone in the movie was cast under their own name for safety purposes, so that if like someone had to yell out at you to kind of like, hey, watch out, then there would be no confusion about who they were shouting out to, because you don't want to get your stage name confused with your actual name, right?
Yeah, but the fact that they thought that beforehand just goes to show what they were putting themselves into.
Exactly, but then also it does show that they had some sensible safety standards.
What, calling each other by their real name?
Yeah, it's the least they could do.
No.
But Mativo, he's a Kenya native, and he obviously points out, like, duh, in real life, we don't actually live with these animals in the way that's depicted in the film, and we certainly don't cuddle with them. But he said that when he finished shooting for the day, he would get the hell out of there as quickly as he could. And he just couldn't believe how people just hung around afterwards with these ferocious beasts just lurking literally everywhere. Above you, below you, to the side, to the left, everywhere. None of them are in cages. So he was just pretty much saying these crazy white people and their arrogance is just outrageous, basically. And it's true.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was Raw.
Good story.
So should we run the outro for this week?
Let's do it.
And that wraps up another journey into the fascinating and the intriguing on the Compendium. If today's episode tickled your curiosity, then please don't forget to hit that follow button on your favorite podcasting app. It makes the world a difference when you do. And for our diehard listeners, next week's episode is waiting for you on our Patreon completely free of charge. If you are hungry for more, then join our Certified Freaks tier to unlock our entire archive and enjoy exclusive content and get sneak peeks of what's coming up next. New episodes drop every Tuesday, and until then, remember, sometimes the real beast isn't the lion. It's the idea that you can tame it. See you next time.
See ya.